Welcome everybody. I'm really honored to be here co-hosting this session and moderating with these amazing panelists. We're going to go ahead and get started in a quick moment. Did want to, first of all, give a vocalized verbal description of myself. So my name is Nicolas Santino. I am a associate professor of Chicano and Chicano Studies at CSU, Channel Islands. I am wearing a black shirt, have glasses, and a pair of headphones. A light-skinned, mixed race man, Asian, Mexican descent, Yaqui indigenous descent. And I'm really, really happy to be here with these amazing scholar activists. And I was really, really honored when I was asked to moderate for this panel. And so to kind of, before we get to our content for this session, I also wanted to thank Adrina and Kiki for being our amazing staffers this afternoon and this entire weekend for sure. So to get started, I did want to offer our land acknowledgement that we do here at CFA. And let me make sure I pull up our write-up for that. So we'd like to acknowledge that we gather as the California Faculty Association on the traditional land of the indigenous people, past and present, in honor of gratitude, the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continue to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. To recognize that land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Acknowledging the land is an important indigenous protocol that we are honoring here today. And I did want to, on my own part, acknowledge the stewards of the land which I live and work in Ventura County, there in California, the Chumash. I am broadcasting here at the Equity Conference from Taos. I'm in New Mexico visiting relatives, so I want to also honor the Taos Pueblo people that are out here. Before we get started, I did want to make sure that, it's been a long day and some folks are just joining the conference for this session. Some have been with us the entire day. We've had some amazing sessions, but each time we start a new session, we want to make sure that we properly ground ourselves in so we can really focus our intentions and really, really give our presenters our full undivided energy and presence. And so what I'd like to do is have us take a quick moment to engage in a community breath, use our breathing as a way to focus our intention and good energy. So let's go ahead and take three cleansing breaths. So I'd like folks to do is slowly inhale through their nose if you can. Hold that for a bit and exhale out through your mouth. We're going to do that 2 more times. Go ahead and take a nice, slow, easy paced inhale through the nose, and let's exhale through our mouths. And one last one, go ahead and take a deep breath in through our nose and a nice cleansing breath out. All right, so that's a way for us to, again, focus our intentions for the session as people that are here to gather in a good way. I'd like to also share our CFA interruptions practice statement. And so as part of our continuing commitment to racial justice work, when we experience examples of racial narratives, racism, or whiteness in our meetings, or as we conduct our business, we will speak up. This means we can interrupt the meeting and draw the issue to one another's attention. We will do this kindly, with care, and in good faith. Further, as we engage interruptions, we will take an intersectional approach, reflecting the fact that white supremacy and racism operate in tandem with interlocking systems of oppression, of colonialism, class, cis heteropatriarchy, and ableism. This statement is a reminder that we commit to do this in the service of ending the system of racial oppression. Folks, I want to introduce our presenters for this afternoon. And so let me go ahead and share some information about Marisa first. And let me grab my notes for for Marisa. Dr. Marisa Salinas is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Justice Studies at CSU San Marcos. She has a bachelor's degree in sociology and Chicano studies from UC Santa Barbara, a master's degree in sociology and Chicano studies, a master's degree in sociology from San Diego State University, and received her PhD in sociology from UC Santa Barbara with a race, ethnicity, and nation concentration and Black studies emphasis. As a working class origin, former first generation student, mentor, and Chicana mama scholar, she believes in the transformative power of mobilizing struggle and is committed to supporting multiply marginalized communities. Her work broadly aims to disrupt the exceptionality and disposability continuum and focuses on Latinas in the academic and prison industrial complexes. I'd like to also introduce Dr. Xuan Santos, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Justice Studies at CSU San Marcos. He serves as the executive director of Project Rebound, the CSUSM chapter. He earned his PhD in sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Santos's area of expertise and publications covers the following areas of interest: the informal economy and global capitalism, transnational migration, convict barrio criminology, gangs and adolescent subcultures, public sociology, race, class, gender, and nation, and tattooing. He served as the 2021-2022 president of the California Sociological Association. An award-winning professor, Dr. Santos received the following recognitions: the 2021 President's Award for Scholarship and Creative Activity, the All People Celebrations Builds Community Award, the Civility Champion Award, and the Civility Icon Award. A Chicano activist scholar and self-taught artist from Bow Heights, he works with the North San Diego community on mural projects and Dia de los Muertos displays. Santos delivers motivational keynotes, presentations at middle schools, high schools, college campuses, and forums. His teaching philosophy seeks to erase the margins by empowering students, invisible and disenfranchised communities. So wherever you are, let's give our presenters a big warm welcome and round of applause, please. I believe we may not, do we have any housekeeping announcements before we move on to our presenters? Seeing as it looks like we don't have housekeeping announcements, so let's go ahead and pass it on over to our fabulous presenters.
Hello, everybody. It is with great enthusiasm that I am here with my fellow CFA members and system-wide CSU faculty and staff. I want to start off by saying that I am a male, light-skinned Chicano, wearing a blue baseball hat, glasses, a gray shirt, and a black vest. I am in my office, and I want to start off before I even present on the topic. I want to acknowledge all the women in this space. I want to say Happy International Women's Day to all of you. It's great. It's a great privilege to work among all of you, all my sheroes and amazing colleagues, including my co-presenter. So with that said, I'm going to start off by operationalizing this concept that we call public sociology. Before I even get into it, I am a proud scholar activist. A lot of the work that I do involves empowering people in the community, paying back my community through research, social justice, and teaching. And one of the biggest things that I need to emphasize that before this concept of public sociology emerged, we were already doing it in my neighborhood. We were already engaged in fighting Proposition 187, fighting all these draconian laws that impact our everyday communities, including gang injunction laws that seek to repress the entire community as a whole. But Michael Borrow, a professor at UC Berkeley, came up with this concept of public sociology. And in a nutshell, he argues that it's a school of thought that allows us to expand our discipline to public broader audience. In this case, people from multiple marginal identities. We incorporate difference by learning what are the major public debates that are happening in the community, and we bring those powerful discourses into the classroom, into the way we produce knowledge and manufacture, sociological thought. So with that said, I want to just say that I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to thank the collective for inviting us. I want to invite Dr. Salinas to share her part.
Hello, everyone. I'm really, really happy to be here as well. As Dr. Santos said, my name is Dr. Marisa Salinas. I am a professor at Cal State University San Marcos. I am a light-skinned Chicana with a black blunt haircut and bright pink lipstick and a lavender sleeveless top. We are so happy to be able to share some of the work that we're doing, and hopefully we can kind of create and facilitate this type of movement that is already going on across the Cal State University system in terms of moving towards public sociology and public scholarship.
So one of the things that we need to emphasize here is that, well, I'm going to be sharing the PowerPoint as we speak. So we wanted to give you a little bit about the work that we do. We're always involved in the community, working with people that are formerly incarcerated, justice impacted, working with crossover youth that are impacted by both, correctional facility system, impacted by the foster care system, working with a broad public. Some of the work that I have done involves, like at Cal State San Marcos, I worked with a lot of people, in concert with a lot of people, to help change the name of a building that represented nativism, racism, anti-immigration, anti-indigenous, and thanks to the support of our campus stakeholders, our community, people that aren't even in the university but in the region, helped us change this name. So I'm very proud to be part of these movements where we meet people and we see value. We see value in individuals where we know and recognize that we belong to each other. The purpose of this talk is to demonstrate through our political activism, our scholar activism, that we have found meaningful ways of, engaging the community with the university, but also having the university engage with the community. And most importantly, I need to emphasize that, we would not be where we are today if it wasn't for our community leaders, our elders that impacted our ways of looking at a world as not something fixed, but as something that we could actively transform. And so a lot of the work that I have been doing has been doing murals, working with people, teaching them skill sets, because this is a state of urgency where we're trying to erase the margins and incorporate people into the system in a way where it's equitable, where it's empowering, or we're giving voice to the voiceless and making communities more visible.
In terms of the work that I've done, much of this work really did begin prior to even kind of getting further along in postgraduate education. I grew up, and so our social context, both Dr. Santos and mine, is extremely important. I think it's going to be really important as we unpack it later in terms of what does doing public scholarship in marginalized communities mean, because our identities do play a significant role in this. So I am a working class origin Chicana. I come from the California Central Valley. I grew up around prisons. And so prior to going into academia with my graduate education, I was actually already working for the UC system in the Center for Educational Partnerships, essentially this hub that the UC system created in the Central Valley, because there was this kind of notion that that even if they build universities, these communities, which were primarily working class communities of color, Latinx communities, migrant communities, weren't going to go into higher ed. And so this kind of hub within the UC was essentially counselors working at middle schools in areas that were surrounded by prisons, in high schools. I also worked for a parent empowerment program where I, was teaching everything about college going culture, resources, and trying to kind of make those bridges. So for us, again, in terms of our lifelong commitment, it's really centered around marginalized communities. It's centered around not seeing the university as this ivory tower where, this wall is not permeable. and the community as something completely separate. We see it's really important to kind of bring the community into the university and also take the university into the community. So again, this is much of the sociocultural context that we bring into this work and the lenses that kind of shape how we kind of oriented this public sociology.
So I need to emphasize that in the San Marcos region, we are constantly dealing with multiple sociocultural arrangements. We're looking at a big community that's segmented, where there's the unfair distribution of resources. If there's a clear distinction between the haves and the have-nots. There's a university right off the 78 corridor, and a lot of the Latinx community members do not even know that that's a university. They don't even know how to even get into the university. So we recognize that there is an academic apartheid. There is, a structure of gentrification that is affecting communities. Communities are being cleansed, pushed out of the regions. You're seeing people that are constantly dealing with this interlocked system of punitive social control, where you see the sheriffs, immigration officers working collaboratively to super criminalize individuals in the community. Draconian laws and legislations are being put forward to keep communities in their place, to push them out of the communities of origin that they come from. We're also seeing that there's a lot of nativism, racism, and this didn't just begin when I got hired in 2011. My honorable colleague, Dr. Sharon Elise, was also, she experienced the racism that is so deeply ingrained in the region. So we have to recognize that this has been an ongoing systemic arrangement that many of us confront. And my struggle with this is that, we recognize that it's still happening. It's coming forth in very overt and covert ways in the community. Also, what we have been finding through our work is that we continuously see the ruling class manufacturing rules and laws and ordinances that affect people of color and people with intersectional identities, and there's zero input coming from those that are targeted. The community does not have a say in what is being applied to the youngsters, what is being applied to the larger community. All we see is that privilege becomes exacerbated to the point where the ruling class dictates how we live, and how we experience everyday life. Sorry, didn't show this slide, but it's pretty much summarizing what I just expressed. So Dr. Salinas and I became involved in this middle school project through a little simple conversation I had with the principal there. The principal of this middle school approached me about a mural project that I designed and worked with members of the local community. She learned that we were working in concert with one another, teaching the youngsters skill sets so that they can produce murals, express aspects of their self-concepts, express aspects of the community. And in this case, I had painted a mural with the youngsters and the community members to show how men and women shape a very critical point in the way we envision our futures and the present in the community. And so while this was happening, the mural was completed by myself when the pandemic happened, because unfortunately we couldn't congregate and finish this work of art. But as I was working on it, I used a mural to teach, to remind people that we could still be creative. We could still find meanings in our lives. We could still find ways to connect culturally with one another. Even though we're going through struggle during the pandemic, it was a difficult, trying time, because I've experienced a lot of social death, especially in my community, Boyle Heights in LA, which had the largest death rate per capita in LA. And when I met with the principal of this middle school, she told me that, she wanted a mural project to take place on campus. So when I went to explore the campus, it was something that was not realistic, given that where she wanted me to organize this mural project with the youngsters was unsafe. So we didn't really have the proper materials or proper tools to make this mural project happen. So we moved on to having a different conversation. And that's when we started to find out that a lot of the youngsters were having a hard time acclimating to in-person instruction. The modalities changed. And so youngsters were struggling with in-face instruction and they felt marginalized. During this time, when I went to speak with the principal, she told me that the mentorship program, which was very strong at one point, experienced attrition. So a lot of youngsters didn't have mentor-mentee relationships that allowed them to cultivate the seeds that gave them meaning, that gave them a sense of belonging to the school. And then I also learned that the Latinx community felt invisible and scapegoated for the crumbling school. The sad thing about this is that there's another middle school 12 miles away, and it's part of the same school district, but yet their students experience economic prosperity and they have more resources. The students are doing far much better. But at this school we're working, and we're trying to figure out what exactly is happening. What can we do to make this a better experience for the students, for the families, so that they can feel visible, accepted, and then so that they can feel that they have a say in the instruction. And then finally, it was our duty to speak to the staff and the teachers so that we could remind them of what kind of context they're teaching in. In the neighborhoods where I grew up, a lot of the homies, when they talk to me, they always remind me of this concept. They always say, do you know where you're at? And that's why I have an understanding that, you know, culturally, even though I come from LA, in San Diego, it's just a different structural arrangement that I have to understand. So with that said, moving on to the next slide.
With this given work, you know, as we were given this request to try to do some type of collaborative work and try to kind of tackle some of these major issues that were going on, we realized that there were some prevailing assumptions that are already at play within the middle school. And I think it's important that, you know, although we're talking about this stuff and it might seem very specific to the given region, especially I think though it's really important that we didn't bring up before that, of course, we're in the Southwest borderlands area. And so there's this very kind of tenuous and very complicated relationship to the border amongst Latinx folks in general, specifically, but also people with varying statuses. You know, different communities are kind of dealing with these different social problems, especially given the fallout of the pandemic differently. But it's important to kind of realize that some of the things that we're about to talk about prevailing assumptions that are going on are really issues that you can see across multiple regions, right? These are ongoing kind of social issues. So for one, when it came to the students, some of the assumptions that were made about the students were that they were presumed incompetent. So at this particular middle school, the demographics of the students are overwhelmingly Latinx, are overwhelmingly working class. I mean, really, definitely, many of the students that are at that school have, different mixed status families, right? Different compositions. And because of that, you know, these culture of poverty perspectives that we see throughout history, really, as pertaining to and apply to Latinx communities that come with really deficit perspectives, are kind of already imbued on these students, right? You know, the adults across their lives that are operating with them, many of them are already operating with that kind of assumption in hand. Other things are that, you know, because these students aren't performing, therefore they must be uninvested, they're not motivated, there's criminological perspectives put on them. They're often being criminalized. We saw it across the entire year over and over and over as we were working with different communities. You know, this notion that they have criminological propensities and or undocumented, you know, they were constantly being scapegoated in a lot of different ways. So really, they were considered kind of this archetype of system failure. When it came to parents, again, because we're overwhelmingly talking about Latinx parents, again, the associations of their students were applied and oftentimes were blamed for the system failures of of the students, right? And so again, there was this notion that, these Latinx parents aren't coming to the various activities that we put on. We keep, putting different activities where we're hoping that they can be more invested in things like the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association, or after school activities, but Latinx parents aren't coming. So because they're not coming and they're not attending, therefore they're not invested in their child's education. There is also this understanding that they're uneducated, the parents, they are uninterested in their students having this college going culture or really seeing education as a viable path for their students. And finally, some of the prevailing assumptions by the faculty, of the faculty and staff, was that they must therefore know what's best for these students. Because if these students are coming from communities that are uneducated, then perhaps they might not know what's best for them. And so there was also an assumption that, if it's administration, that they must have the students' best interests at heart, and that they understand the sociocultural realities of the students and the families, and that they potentially share in those sociocultural realities. So a lot of times people make the assumption, again, this is not just at this school, but schools broadly, which is an unfair and untrue assumption when we're looking at multiply marginalized populations, that, the faculty and staff, they probably live in that community, or they send their kids to either that school or to neighborhood schools, but unfortunately that is not the case. So our response, and so we're kind of cueing in the faux co-liberation, was how are we going to tackle this, this request? So for us, it was really important for us to think about using what I, have called in different kind of parameters for different types of research, this social ecology approach. Because oftentimes we approach or even think of, say, student quote unquote failure as being a result. It's only of them. It's this individualistic act, right? And so the reality is that a social ecology approach looks at this notion that you cannot put students in one silo in terms of how they're performing, families or the community in a silo, and as well as the administration and the faculty and the student, the school system. It has to be this multifaceted approach that really kind of, that's where the notion of these preemptive seeds comes from. We can't blame students when they're coming to the Cal State University many years later and thinking that they're not performing, and blaming it on the high schools, and the high schools are blaming it on the students, and the high schools might be blaming it on the families. And so everybody's kind of pointing around as to whose problem it actually is and where it actually stems from. We know that it has to be this kind of co-constitutive approach that really immerses these three prongs: the students, the communities, and so therefore their families, as well as the administration. So what we did was we essentially decided to kind of take on this series of workshops with students, families, and faculty and staff. And so while we created this list of different workshops that we thought might be, and they're extremely interactive, that might be useful for each kind of stakeholding demographic or group, later on, the topics were generated by students as being particularly important to them, and as well as school stakeholders. And so the district did have some kind of ongoing implicit bias trainings and things like that. But so that helped us. We didn't want to kind of hit two birds with one stone. We wanted to hit two birds with one stone and perhaps do, workshops on different things that weren't possibly being covered.
There were also, we need to highlight the value behind the topics that were generated by the students, and the school stakeholders really shaped how we addressed these key workshops and presentations that were produced at the school campus and on Zoom. From the students, what was really cool was that they really wanted to know about gangs, the ways gangs are socially constructed in the community. How is it that law enforcement practitioners come into these communities, use fear-mongering strategies to keep people in their place? Another topic that was very important to them is mentorship. Mentorship is very important to them. In fact, tomorrow, Marisa and I will be presenting at the middle school and addressing this idea of, how do we cultivate social change, transformation? How do we empower the youngsters to see futures beyond what people have handed to them? And I'm talking about the previous administration at the school. We're also going to be addressing the concept of at-promise youth, because a lot of people use a lexicon term of at risk to say that these kids are at risk of committing crime, at risk of dropping out. How about promoting the ideology that these youngsters show promise and will become future contributors of our communities, of our universities, the way we produce knowledge? And so I really felt enamored by the fact that the students really wanted this. Now, on the parent side, the parent and family side, the parents really wanted these important key topics to emerge, and they came up when we met with them. The first one is college-going culture. Parents want to take an active role in cultivating the seeds that push their kids to go to college. They wanted to learn about cultural community wealth. They said it in various ways, but that's what it was. How is it that the skill sets that they already have learned in their homes, through oral traditions, through cultural practices, manufacture this need for future aspirations? We wanted to address anti-deficit perspectives, and finally, schooling wounds and trajectories, topics that the families asked us to address. On the faculty and staff, the administration and other stakeholders wanted us to talk about sociocultural context. Where exactly is it that the school is situated? What are the backgrounds of the predominantly Latinx, Mexican community? What are they about? And also community cultural wealth was a topic that we addressed with the faculty. Now we're going to move on to outcomes. Each particular group represented different outcomes, and we're going to talk about them in the following. So students wanted a better we found that students had a better understanding of the structural conditions that affect their everyday lives and how they are tied to what might be considered a personal and individual path. In other words, it wasn't about rational choice, but it was more about what are the structural conditions that lead to these hegemonic oppressions that affect them in their everyday lives. We're talking about walking to school, catching the public transportation, and having to deal with police on the train or on the bus. We're talking about repressive regimes that are in their everyday lives that remind them of othering. What we found during our workshops was that students were very outspoken. The moment we started to address these topics, they started to really collaborate and comment on how this was so relevant to their everydayness. And those that didn't experience had a better understanding of their peers. The other thing that happened is that we learned that even though these are middle school students, these are uncredentialed experts that could testify and speak about their lives in a very expert or professional way, where they understand each other and value each other's epistemologies. And so we learned that there are many social ills that are detrimental to their everyday lives that affect not only them as students, but the entire Latinx community as a whole. The students had a better understanding of the barrio ecologies that affect them in their everydayness. On the family perspective, the outcome was that families were very moved. There were a lot of emotions, parents vicariously living through their kids' experiences as middle school students. A lot of families didn't go to middle school, so they were really excited about their kids going there. The parents were so excited about this experience that they spoke openly about mobilizing other parents that didn't attend because they felt that the message needed to get out. The other thing is that families are impacted by experiences of their kids at school. There's intergenerational school wounds that affect not only them, but it's affected their, siblings, it's affected their, ancestors, other elders in the community. So this isn't something new. This has been going on for many years.
Can I just jump in really quick, Dr.
Yeah.
Santos? In terms of that, I think that that's really important that, we're primarily working with Latinx parents, and we're opening up this space. And, of course, we're going towards and we're orienting towards going about a college going culture and teaching these families about resources, and not being afraid of things like, these various pathways, financial, paths and whatnot. And the thing is that what I noticed, or what we noticed, is that these Latinx parents are actually, they want to talk about their own schooling wounds. They want to talk about, the unfortunate type of pathways they've had within, their own, K through 12 experiences. Like, they're really trying to kind of unpack their histories with being treated with these deficit perspectives that we see time and time again. And so, I think it's really important that these schools really offer and kind of facilitate this bridge towards parents being able to unpack their own experiences. And until you actually do that, can you actually get to kind of more of the root of like then going towards their students? Because how can these parents properly push these kids in a really healthy way, in the ways that the schools really wants them to, when the parents' understandings of what it looks like to be a Latinx student, given their own experiences, is to be put down, to be criminalized, to be never asked about the possible pathways of going to college, or maybe, many of them talked about, being put in vocational programs automatically. And so they're still seeing this lens, and their understanding of the K through 12 system, or even pathways to college, is really shaded by their own experiences. And so that was something that really emerged.
Thank you. Another thing that these meetings did is that it motivated parents who push kids to start thinking about educational attainment. Another thing that it did is that it motivated parents to start seeking out allies that are going to nurture that space, so that kids could be in community with other kids and they could learn collectively. And finally, a very important thing is that this wasn't just about meritocracy and the kids' own success. The families were more about communal learning, about advancing everybody as a collective, not just seeing that one kid be recognized for having honors, but they want the entire community to be overachievers through the support of the networks that are available on the campus. And finally, the parents believe that there needs to be more meetings that are bilingual, especially with Spanish language, because parents want to feel included. They want to feel like the curriculum is addressing their unique needs as community members. They want to see that there's an educational pathway that's going to not only empower the kids to get degrees or to get their, to graduate, but also empower other parents to go back to school, to find other ways of learning. And what's important here to say is that, people are not alone. People are not alone when they're dealing with this type of structural arrangement. And the final part that will be addressed is that the families are always trying to deconstruct and challenge the educational roadblocks that promote academic apartheid. This is something that everybody addressed, all the families. They recognize that they are seen as a subaltern, seen as the second-class citizenship group in that context. And now we're going to move on to the administrative staff outcome.
In terms of outcomes with the administration staff, what we saw is that it essentially these workshops expanded the parameters of where these discussions take place about pedagogy, about the performance of students and whatnot. And so, based on our own interactions, as well as conversations that we've had with other folks that are within the middle school, and within the community that they've had outside of the community, many of them took a lot of our talks and started having these kind of informal, casual conversations and unpacking some of the things we said as like water cooler talk, or they were talking about it with their families or in the communities. And so I personally found that to be one of the great successes of this work. And this really allowed a pathway for competing types of discourses to really emerge, because the truth is not everybody's going to want to have these kind of difficult conversations, right, at the professional workplace in this really high visibility area. And so it's good that, folks were able to take it and have, more informal conversations. Another thing was that it really was this kind of introduction to engaging in difficult conversations. The administration and staff were able to discuss competing ideologies and discourses that affect pedagogy. And so with the workshops for the administration that we were talking about, I want to say in the last slide or the slide before that, it wasn't necessarily doing this kind of socio-historical context type of workshop, wasn't something immediately that they asked for, right? Or wasn't something, I wouldn't even say that the overall faculty and staff asked for, but it was something that us as sociologists knew was really, really important to do. You're talking about a very brown, very working class, mixed status area that's fairly close to the border in the Southwest borderlands area. And so, of course, we had to give this kind of socio-historical background so that, faculty and staff could actually understand these are the pervasive ideologies that students and families in the area may not use academic jargon. They may not, have what we use $64 million words, right? But they very, very much know, just like Dr. Santos says, they understand barrio ecologies. They understand what certain looks like at them. They understand what leads to their criminalization and various profiling. And so it was really important that we bring in these areas of inquiry into this academic administrative space so that they could actually understand these are the things that lead to kind of othering processes or even attrition amongst students. Other things, so some of those might be that affect the pedagogy: policing, gentrification, immigrant suppression, economic disparities, things like rising rent. I literally covered the fact that rent in the in the San Diego area is, everywhere really, but especially in the San Diego area, is skyrocketing. So what does that mean for working class families of color? The parents are working more jobs, longer stretches at a time. Students are really trying to take care of themselves and one another, their younger siblings. Of course, that is going to feed into that work. And so if we can understand that as sociologists, I give my students at, Cal State San Marcos books to read, and they can understand that makes sense, right? To students in faraway countries. Why can't we understand that impacts kids right here down the street, in our own backyards? And so, we brought into some of those things, as well as these administration had to really kind of reconcile the differences in their own upbringing versus their students. They had to imagine that their students live a very different reality. Again, it's like I just said a couple of slides ago, these folks don't necessarily come from the same communities. And when I say the same communities, yes, you might live in San Marcos. Yes, you might live the next city over, but you actually don't come from the same community. You don't live those same realities. You don't live in those barrios. You don't, you're not living where you have, 8 to 10, 12 people to a 2-bedroom home. Again, that's a different community. And so they really did learn that they have to re-strategize their pedagogy.
If I may interject for a quick second, I do want to remind our attendees that we do have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please, please, please post any questions you may have for our presenters in the Q&A box.
Thank you for that reminder. Now we're moving on to the difficulties of this work. And the first one is that we, as researchers, we as community workers, we as social justice advocates, we're often accused of overly identifying with the oppressed. They say that we lose our objectivity, that we're going native. But this is the same type of lexicon that is used against us in the academy, where we're always being told the same type of ideology. And, the thing is that a lot of people accuse us of doing more like research, and that we're like losing our legitimacy, that we're like our legibility is in question. So it's important to recognize that many times, even though we do this as a labor of love, because we recognize and identify with the struggle, it is also, we're cross-examined in a very trivial way because of our connection to the community.
In addition to what we also experienced was many microaggressions, unfortunately. And so, oftentimes we see that the ruling class will use microaggressions to kind of dismiss knowledge claims made by specific or especially multiply marginalized groups. And so we saw that with, while we're presenting different types of facial gestures, grimacing, some folks were passing notes, and I am not referring to students, unfortunately, reading newspapers in the middle of us actually presenting, sharing computer terminals, speaking over us. I noticed the gendered component of that. I definitely experienced, I would say that they spoke over myself more than Dr. Santos. There were contrarians, or we all know, especially as we're professors and different folks from different ranges of the university system, but these contrarians are they just want to play devil's advocate, right? And so they're not necessarily even addressing the content, but suggestions on how we could be better presenters. And so that was kind of difficult to navigate. It's sometimes people want to use their own one-time story, this micro kind of orientation, to try to disrupt what we actually are showing, these structural processes. And so it's funny, one of our colleagues actually, somebody that she knows works at this school, and they were saying, apparently, again, they were having water cooler talk amongst, different folks who work at the school. And I guess that they were saying no, actually, it is true what Dr. Salinas was saying. I did look up, because I even went into redlining and segregation and this historical aspect. So again, people were really thrown off by the structural and the historical, and would try to downplay those things quite a bit. Another thing is the black backlash. And so, it's not necessarily something that's happening, but we try to be, Dr. Santos and I try to be very conscientious of the fact that there could be this kind of victim blaming kind of mentality between both students and teachers, that that these kids are using rational choice, and therefore they know they're deliberately choosing not to actually do this work, and if we're contesting that, then potentially students might get a harder time in class and things like that. And so we're as we're doing this work, we're always thinking about potential backlash and different ramifications. But I would say at the end of the day, given all of this work, again, the prevailing assumption still is that, Latinx communities are, incompetent. This meritocratic kind of facade really that exists is still undergirds all of the work, all of the understandings that are actually going down. And this meritocratic driven rhetoric of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is still the predominant ideology that we are contending with in all of the work that we do. In terms of the hyper and invisible labor in the CSU, and so I should note that much of the work that I do looks at women of color and specifically Latina faculty in the university, and very much looks at hyper and invisible labor in the CSU. This work is extremely time consuming, I will say, because we want to be really conscientious of what we're doing. And, we approach it in a way where we at any given time, at no given time do we ever want to be where we are the experts and we're telling people what to actually do. And so we try to be very conscientious, very deliberate in how we strategize, and that can be very time consuming in addition to the other work that we do. Another thing that makes this work hyper and also invisible labor in the Cal State is that while our institution, I would say, is really great about making this work legible in terms of our RTP standards, right? As great work in terms of service, not all institutions give this form of work and service legibility. And so other Cal States, other university systems may not have this type of service be deemed as service in their RTP standards. And so if you want to do this work, a lot of times the types of work that is given legibility when it comes to service is work that's only going to directly benefit, in this very unfortunate capitalist oriented way, the university system. And if it doesn't directly benefit the university system, then it's not service work that goes towards your RTP standards. for our university, it is. And so again, because we see this, it being, there should not be any borders or barriers, right, between the ivory tower and the broader community. It's just important to think that, you know, I can understand why some people don't necessarily take on this work if it's not getting legibility and they already have so much other types of labor that they actually have to do in order to kind of be promoted. And finally, it's difficult. One of the most difficult, if not the most difficult thing about this work is that oftentimes when you're doing this type of work, some of these folks that you're kind of pushing back about to question the ideologies and practices of what's going on for, you know, these students and how we can benefit students and admin and communities. A lot of people think that they know what's best for these students, or in fact, those students. And so it's sometimes like walking a tightrope, because we are professionals, we do this work, we're coming from the university system, but you're constantly trying to be very conscientious about your positionality and letting people know of like disrupting these ideas that they know what's best for those students, but also not making it seem as if we are trying to tell them what to do. So it can be very, very difficult in that way.
So finally, we're going to address a couple of points regarding the way we take sociology to the streets and what it means. First of all, I need to make a statement about social justice work, community work that we do. I will still do it, even if I didn't get RTP credit. I would do it because these are communities that mirror my identity, my background. I went to a school in Boyle Heights that really didn't care about students. A lot of the teachers there were more concerned about establishing a law and order space. They were about punitive social control. They acted like correctional officers. They reminded students that schools were not enjoyable, that you didn't belong. And I always had that in the back of my head, that I never want to have that experience in my educational trajectory. As a Chicano, or a former undocumented person, you know, from a working class poor community, I saw how these impacts really affected a lot of my friends. I always reflect on my friends that didn't make it, my friends that didn't survive, my friends that ended up in carceral systems. And I always vowed that this is the kind of work I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life in helping others. So I would do this regardless whether I get credit from the ivory tower. The credit I get is when I see a student challenge and defy those odds. When I see a person who everybody didn't believe in become that person of his or her own design. So that's part of my my biography that really shaped who I am as a servant to the community, a person that believes in la quech love, this you are my other me philosophy, where I belong to my community, they belong to me, and we're working together to achieve collective means. Let's see. The other thing that I just want to affirm is that we're not just stuck in the ivory tower, but we are public servants. We're always going to stand in the face of oppression. We're going to stand on the side of the colonized, and we're going to collectively remind each other that they have allies, that what they have to say as everyday experts is very important, that they have everyday life PhDs, that they have everyday life credentials that could teach us a lot about how the world works, how academia functions, and beyond.
Another aspect of the public sociology we do is that it's so important to empower multiple ecologies and empower multiple ecologies. You cannot, and it's not, before we even get to the empowering aspect of it, and I will say this because, you know, we are speaking to, you know, CFA folks, so I think that we all kind of understand, you know, the research aspect of it. I've never understood when people can do research and kind of only approach it. You want to answer these research questions, but you're only approaching it from, like, again, this silo, as if social life or phenomena is not relational, right? And it doesn't have that one impact doesn't impact the other. You know, when I wrote about, like, for instance, in my previous research, and I'm probably butchering it, excuse me, but I think this is a great way to kind of close in on this, is that I imagine in my former work, when I'm approaching something, when it comes to research, there's this Indian parable, and it's kind of like, like these blind men, and they have this animal, it's an elephant, but they're blind, and they're asking them, like, what is this animal? And so one is essentially feeling the ear, and it's like, oh, it's flat and round, like almost like an eel. And another one is just feeling the trunk, and they're like, oh no, it must be a snake, right? And so every single person is only kind of, looking at one part of this animal, and they're thinking that they see the big picture, but in reality they don't see the big picture. There's only this little part, and we have to kind of bring it all together to understand what it actually is. And so that's how we feel about empowering multiple ecologies, because you can't, again, going back to the seeds, we cannot be mad that these plants don't grow in the ways that we don't, if we know that one part of their ecology is not watering them, and the other one might be trampling them. Like, we're all kind of connected to one another. And so that's really important to us. And then finally, what I call the politics of cariño. We approach this work with this kind of understanding, well, people are imperfect, communities are, and all of us are imperfect, right? Giving folks the benefit of the doubt. And so cariño comes from this notion of care, right? This kind of rich, deep felt care. And we really do, we have what essentially this social justice kind of orientation to us, that, like, while we could assume the worst of people and communities, we don't, right? Like, it's easy for us to be frustrated with, various systems failing and structures failing, and thinking like, oh my God, look at this group, like, they're hurting our students in this way, or don't they see they're holding, like, the reality is that we should all be in this together. And so if we can really empower each aspect of this various multiple aspect of the ecology with cariño, with care, and with the understanding that each area is really trying their best, then I think that we can actually get somewhere.
So I want to remind the CFA collective that this labor of love is very important to emphasize when doing this kind of work. It's very emotional, it's draining, but it's also very empowering to see that you could transform conditions, you could empower people. I love hearing youngsters speaking up and their abilities to even contest the police when they're doing something that's unlawful, calling truth to power. And when I was in LA, I worked with the Youth Justice Coalition. And when I was there, we used to do a chant at the end of our meetings to remind each other that we are people that are united to promote social change, to promote solidarity. And we always said this chant that I have on this PowerPoint by Asada Shakur is the mantra that governs and shapes what we do in the community. And the statement goes as, it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. We say this in synchronously 3 times, and as we say it, it gets louder and louder, and it's just amazing to feel like we belong to each other, to see that there's cohesion. And one of the best experiences as a scholar activist is to work alongside my good friend, my colleague, Dr. Salinas, because we both come from oppressed and carceral communities, and just paying back our communities, empowering communities gives our work even more meaning. And, even though we could be doing other things, this is a work that really shapes our calling to be even better sociologists, being public sociology, servants of the community, taking sociology to the streets and reminding communities that we matter. We all matter as a collective. So with that said, I want to say thank you all for attending, for inviting us. And, we look forward to the Q&A section that's coming up.
All right, wherever you are, at home, in your office, or wherever else you may be, let's give a big warm round of applause for our presenters. That was an amazing presentation, and a lot to definitely inspire us here in CFA. but also a great impetus for conversation and discussion in terms of how each of us on our own campuses can strive to do this type of service, you know. And we do have a few questions here in the chat. I want to transition to some of these questions that have been posted, but as a way to get started, I actually had a question of my own. As you mentioned, a lot of these at promise youth, they've been burnt. They've been burnt by the educators, the so-called educators in their lives. And so how did you, as sort of, as adults, as educators in your own right, work to rebuild that confidence and rebuild that trust with the youth?
I think I'm gonna defer to my colleague, and then
I was going to say it is very difficult, right? And I think that that's something that I wanted Dr. Santos and I to kind of talk about and kind of unpack a little bit, because while this work is important, I've also seen it not done well, in the sense of like folks who don't come from those communities coming in and kind of thinking that they are the expert and telling them, oh, I can save you, or this very savior-like thing. And so students know it right away. People think if you're from that community, people can see right through you a mile away. But I mean, even in terms of getting a little closer to your question, like tomorrow, we've already designed, there's students who have been already unfortunately kind of spotlighted as being kind of at risk, but we kind of reoriented it with the faculty and staff of being at promise. And so what we're doing is we're not having a lecture. It is not going to be a lecture based, because what good is it to be a lecture? Dr. Santos and I are literally opening it up. I have some guiding things, and some of the guiding questions are like, who are you? Who actually are you? And then we're moving into who is the person that you imagine them to imagine you to be, right? And where are you misunderstood? Where are the misunderstandings? Again, we're going towards what are some of the things that you're contending with? Like and we're not using this language, but what are some of the issues that you're grappling with? In an ideal world, what do you actually need? But we're trying to kind of really facilitate a conversation. And above all else, when we enter any type of space, it's about reciprocity. So guess what? When I enter that space, I'm not coming in as like the expert, and Dr. Salinas has this expert hat. I'm saying, you know what? Once upon a time, I was you. I used to get kicked out of school all of the time. My schools were also hardcore defunded, very much police. They look like prisons. I used to have desks in the very back of the room. But so it's this reciprocal kind of space that I think is not specific to these students, but it's something that we all want, right? Like anytime, I mean, again, we're talking to the CFA, anytime, we're doing research, I would imagine folks are opening up with like, I'm an open book to them. Like, we are here, we are invested in one another. I'm not here to judge you. Again, I'm coming from a politic of cariño because I want to better understand you.
I wanted to also add that thank you for sharing a lot of those points I was going to address, Marisa. Dr. Salinas raised very pivotal, important points as we're doing our everyday work. One of the things that I find very effective is that I own my wounds. I go back to when I was a youngster, and I try to use my own reflexivity agenda to address, this is how I experienced it, but this is me now. But now I want to hear how you experience the world. And part of being in those spaces includes being vulnerable, owning your vulnerability, speaking from the heart, and not dismissing people and valuing everybody's epistemologies. As a scholar, I developed this concept known as OG, not original gangster, but as a lexicon term meaning opportunity giver, where you use your privileged platform to give your advantage away to those who have not felt like they've been included. We want to promote a concept of we-ness, solidarity. We want to remind people that all their positionalities, their intersectional realities are equally important. I'm not just embracing heteronormative ideologies. I'm talking about difference from different walks of life, immigration status. Our youngsters are affected. I've had students at the middle school tell me, I can't even go to the restroom without a security guard peeking over the stall to see if I'm doing my business. And that's the kind of stuff that has been normalized in a lot of our schools, especially among youth of color, LGBTQ plus youngsters, dealing with, disabled folk. And we need to seriously have more allies and have more correctional officers in those schools. Like, we need to get rid of those community resource officers that super criminalize our youngsters and even arrest youngsters on the spot. So that's my piece.
Thank you. We have some questions that have come in, and so I want to share some of the questions that have been posted by our attendees. And the first is by Dr. Sharon Elise, and so she asked, how should what you've shared about Latinx middle school students inform our pedagogies at HSIs in the CSU? As a follow-up, how do the experiences of Latinx middle school students compare to Latinx students in the CSU?
I would say I would start off. I mean, I really kind of the answers to both of those things are completely connected to each other. It's kind of like the same question, in the sense that you got to understand that if there is a Latinx student that's there sitting in our classes, and so so Dr. Sharon Elise is one of my colleagues as well. We're really fortunate to have, most of our students are Latinx students, and I feel like that's one of the greatest things ever for me as a Chicana. But you got to understand that if there's a Latinx student, even a Latinx student that's struggling in your class at the Cal State level, understand that they went through that at the middle school level. So if they're there, they've been through a lot of shit, and they fought really, really, really hard to get there. The other aspect I would say is that we see a continuity, right? As folks who are dealing at the intersections of multiple layers of marginality, that doesn't, and I'm speaking about this as a sociologist, but that doesn't just drop off at the middle school level. And in some ways, it only gets exacerbated at the university level. And so while these kids maybe, at the middle school level are dealing with like seeing their parents work all of these jobs, and then therefore they're taking care of their 4 siblings, and then maybe they're working, helping their parents clean houses and do housekeeping on the weekends, and they don't have time to do all this. Once they get to our level, once they get to the CSU, it is like that on steroids. Like that is the reality, because I came from teaching at UC Santa Barbara before. And so where those students' master statuses, they get to, many of them, not all of them, but their master status is student. At this Cal State level, it's not. Their moms, their dads, their parents, their caretakers, they're working 2-3 jobs. People are in my classes driving Amazon trucks, right? And so I have to really kind of step back and understand that it's completely connected. The things that those issues are exacerbated where they're at now. Now they are those parents, and now rent is higher than ever. They're dealing with different types of legal statuses and all these different stressors. And so I'm kind of in the position of those administrators at the middle school, because I also have to think about, okay, pedagogically speaking, how can I approach teaching them, making them kind of accountable for their work and making their time in my classroom count, where they're going to take something, but also at the same time, I understand that they're juggling so many different balls. And so it's difficult, right? It's an ongoing kind of process, but I try to be very mindful of that. The fact that, again, they have many statuses. There's not one master status that they can actually speak to and get to it's a luxury to just be a student. And unfortunately, for the vast majority of Cal State students, that is not something that they have.
I'll just add very quickly that, even I'm going to deviate a little bit from that question. I want to remind everybody that the moment our students from the region that attended the middle school that we're talking about, they find out that we're doing these presentations, the students automatically are asking us, hey, how can I get involved? I want to go back and tell my story. The students need to hear that it was hard, but I navigated this. We could do this. And they're excited. They want to go back and just share. So what I tell my colleagues a lot of times is sometimes we have to open up those opportunities and bring along students at the university to come to the community when possible, because that's another way of showing how the academic trajectory works and how we could transform this when we open up windows of opportunity. So I just wanted to just say that.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got another question from another San Marcos colleague. And so this is from Dr. Kristen Bates. And as it says, thank you so much, Dr. Salinas and Santos, for this presentation and for your amazing work. My question is, what can CSU, SM, and other institutions do next in conjunction with their surrounding community to embrace and hold up our middle school and high school students? Are there institutionalized programs or ideas that we could explore?
I think a lot about many opportunities we've had. And I'm thinking about our former colleague, Mohammed Abu Maye, who was also involved in doing this kind of work, but with the Somali community. And I was thinking like, wow, he's creating a pipeline. We need more Black students on our campus. We need to do more programming to increase diversity because we don't have it. We have a lot of students that don't see themselves with the professorships that we have. So programs that exist, yeah, we have programs like Project Rebound that allow us to attract people who are formerly incarcerated just as impacted. We have a trio that brings in foster care students. We have programs. But the hardest thing is that sometimes we expect them to come to us. And what we're not doing is going to them. We're not bringing the institution to them. We're not doing the public sociological work to let people know, hey, just so you know, see those damn buildings there? Those are universities. You want to know how to get there? You want to know what are the processes? Because a lot of people withhold that information. You have teachers that only tell their honor students, their gifted students, their, what they imagine the true at promise students are. But we need to do is get out there. We got to take sociology, any discipline, political science, chemistry to the streets, not just have, oh, we're having a stem cell day and just parade this beautiful experience at the school. Hell no. Why don't you get out of that space, that bubble, and go where the people are at? So I think that Dr. Bates asked a very important question. And the question is that too many people are just comfortable just having people come to us.
Thank you. Thank you for go ahead.
Can I just very quickly, I think that the solution is, again, to Angela Davis says that walls turn sideways are bridges, right? I love that. Because it's true. Like, if we keep these two communities completely separate, and what do you think is going to happen? And so that's why even if we want to look at this as like scholars, right? Like, the certain communities continually get spotlighted over and over and over within research because they're in the surrounding R1s, and they're easily accessible, right? But the reality is that we need to kind of, make that line a lot fuzzy. Remove that line, remove that border, create a bridge out of it. And so one of the things that is really empowering, particularly for multiply marginalized people in general, but particularly students, is to get, because I hate, one of the things that drives me crazy, sorry not to get too riled up, but it's when my students of color, particularly Latinxs, are like, I never had a role model to look up to. And they always tell me that, Dr. Salinas, I never had a role model in my life, And I'm like, you had them, they just didn't look like how you envisioned, what a powerful person or professional person looks like, right? We have hustlers in our community, hard workers, people who love richly and deeply and care for one another. But my point is that for them, oftentimes one of the most powerful things to really mobilize multiply marginalized students is to see people who look like them. So that means more professors that come from their communities on campus, right? And to let them know that they can do it, but also like we've already been in the talks of like getting some of our students from Cal State San Marcos and taking them out there to be a part of the mentorship program for the middle school students. And then also the other way around, I was talking to some folks, I have an idea about doing like literally a completely like a family oriented day at Cal State San Marcos, where we bring in the community and they bring in, I'm not kidding, you bring in your tia, your tío, your grandpa, your grandma, your parents, and they can come to us and we can have conversations about what college is like. They can come to another thing, come to my classes. I tell my students, I'm teaching an immigration and justice class. I'm like, bring your mom. You know, I often, when I was teaching through Zoom, they would come by and they would say, there's no way. I'd see the señoras back there cooking and they'd be like, there's no way that's your professor. Why? Because we've never been able to imagine, right? That, you know, Chicanas and Latinas who are teaching about these things could be at that level. And so I think that it's, again, blurring those boundaries and mixing it and really kind of, again, this reciprocal language that, you know, this diversity, equity, inclusion stuff, I'll call it, is always talking about it, but let's be about it.
I wanted to just close by adding one final component. One of the things that we created through Project Rebound was the Each One Teach One program, where what we did is we developed a model where we're not just going to the traditional schools, we're going to the probationary schools. We're also going to JCCS. We're going to the continuation schools, because we also want to attract those students that society has given up on. We want to interrupt the school to prison pipeline by creating a prison to school pipeline. So what's happening here is that we have people that are formerly incarcerated, just as impacted, and they're going as JCCS. That what's it called? The juvenile courts. It's like the probationary schools that it's just one step away from going to prison. It's a terrible system, but what's happening here is that you have students that are formerly incarcerated who are mentoring students that are in high school, and they're interrupting the system by mentoring youngsters and teaching them about, you know, student success programs on our campus, early admissions, special admissions. So these are other mechanisms that we have created. And this is just last year, we got this grant to help recruit students in the community by going to these spaces and not just the traditional schools.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're coming down. We have about a little bit more than a dozen minutes left in our session. So I want to work through some of these questions that have been posted here in a timely manner. So we can probably do maybe 2 or 3 of the questions and comments here. Some words of encouragement, some words of affirmation from Rosalina Quintanar. So I wanted to share that. She had some really powerful words of affirmation for our presenters. Great presentation. The work you're doing is very valuable. Stay strong. Very few scholars have the knowledge and ability to connect with the community. If you get criticism, it's because of racism and resentment, because they're unable to carry it out. So you have the tools and the spirit. Congratulations. That was from Rosalinda. We do have a question from Charles, and you know, listening to your presentation, I see your ethnic studies training peeking through as sociologists. And so Charles asked, you know, your project and presentation has many connections with ethnic studies and their connection with communities, bringing knowledge and activism to communities and learning from communities how to do the work they need. And additionally, with ethnic studies and the 4 core disciplines being required in K through 12 in California, how will this help maybe in shifting the culture in schools to be more responsible to the students, the parents, and the community?
I feel like I missed the very end of what you said, but I will say it's true. I will speak for Dr. Santos because I know it's something that we've talked about before. Absolutely big connections. The thing is that ethnic studies folks, this is nothing new. Ethnic studies folks have been saying this and doing this since the 60s. And if we have to back things up by data in order to prove how effective it is, how important it is true that the studies continuously show over and over and over that multiply marginalized students have much higher rates of staying in school, of graduating, of going to college when they actually see themselves reflected in their histories, actually reflected in the curriculums that they get, right? And we believe in, and I'm really big on like pushing this, not education, educación, right? Where we are interested, and when I talk about, and oftentimes you don't think about it as a social ecology, that's kind of like a social work approach. But I apply that to here because educación is more than just this silo of education and being taught to the test and how well did you do and what is your rank and what is your GPA. It's about being a well-rounded person that has a beautiful connection, right? That's bigger than just what you learn in books. And so again, I think that ethnic study, it is kind of very much this kind of ethnic studies model that we're implementing. And I'm sorry, I don't know that if I missed the very end of what you said.
Yes, and so with ethnic studies being a graduation requirement, not just for the CSU, but also for K through 12, do you feel that this might make a more, do you feel like this will create change in our K through 12 schools? What are your thoughts?
I'm hoping that it does promote change, because what we're seeing across the country, like in Florida, Arizona, they're anti a lot of our ethnic study curriculum perspectives. And some of these people, the decision makers of power elite, make decisions where they're banning books and topics without even having any knowledge of it. They don't even read those materials, but yet these are people that are driven by nativist perspectives, xenophobia, racism. So I have a feeling that it will impact some people. I'm a skeptic, because when we're seeing these microaggressions in our own face, while we have the credentials to prove we've done the research, we have facts, people are resisting us still. And it's not just about a micro level aggression, but we're looking at these macro level orientations or macro level aggressions that constantly reminds that it's also very systemic, structural. And we're being attacked by many policy writers. Some people are banning the concept of Latinx. I think somebody became governor, that's the first thing they did. They banned Latinx as a top concept. And so the idea here is that we're going to have resistance. We're always going to have backlash. We're going to have the haters. So if this was a perfect world, that's what I would really love, to see more people lobby or correct or transform the logics that are present. Because, as people of color, we get tired of constantly educating the ruling class. We need people from the ruling class who also be spokespeople, the anti-racist people, to speak up. And we're just tired of being the voice of reason when people don't even value us. So I'm just concerned.
But I also think that it depends, just to kind of circle back, it depends on who's teaching those classes. Like, think about it, and I'm thinking this from a feminist orientation. When sex ed is actually mandated within the context of K through 12 schools, you know what I mean, from let's say 6th grade on, but the quality of education is not across the board. Many folks are teaching in this very problematic, very conservative way, and it could be, if this is mandated, if it's not being taught in the correct way, it can also be a problem. And who's teaching those classes? So I'm hopeful, but I don't necessarily think that it's a for sure win for all students. It's going to change everything. No.
Thank you. We have time for one, maybe two more. We have time for one, maybe two more questions. And this one came in from Melissa Cadenas Dow. And the question is, thank you, Dr. Salinas and Santos. I am a librarian at the CSU. What can library faculty do to support multiple ecologies and practice the politics of cariño at our campuses?
A good question. I'm trying to think about how I would approach that. I mean, I would think, and I'm just kind of thinking about my past training, but so one of my mentors is George Lipschitz in Black Studies, or formerly in Black Studies. And so what was really interesting was that he was very instrumental in in getting folks who have shared kind of constellations of struggle to get together in this very interdisciplinary way, right? And so, as opposed to being just the sociologist with the sociologist and the geography folks, and where everybody again is kind of separated and segregated in silos, it was like, okay, who is against massive gentrification or redlining, like, so you have these areas and these topics of interest, these social justice kind of hubs, that could essentially be kind of these shells of interest to mobilize kind of folks across campus. And so even I'm thinking about, like, I'm in my second year and I personally don't feel like I've met many faculty across my university at all, to be quite honest. And I don't know very many people. But I do know that there are good people out there, and I would love to be in community and in solidarity with them. So I could potentially see, like a librarian working amongst other folks who are social justice oriented across campus. You don't have to be a faculty member. You could be a student, and we can kind of create something, these areas, these constellations of struggle where we mobilize in that way and that are interdisciplinary. And then we can kind of construct something to take them out into the community and then bring them in.
Yeah, and just again, I really value the work that our library team has put together on our campus to promote cariño, social justice. When we were trying to do the Craven name change, we found that our librarian team was very involved. They were constantly looking for ways to promote a safe space on campus, from finding literature, finding resources for students to read up on, so that they know exactly what are the legacies or histories that have been embedded in the historical memory of our campus. So I think doing that kind of work, bringing presenters to speak at the library, hosting events that deal with these topics is very beneficial. Students will go. They will definitely go, especially when they see themselves in the topics that they're presenting on. And cariño would be a centerpiece.
All right, so we have one more question. We get to our last question. I want to make sure that our presenters have the last word. So before we go ahead and ask that last question, I want to encourage everybody to, if you haven't done so already, browse our landing page. We have a lot of information related to the conference. If there's sessions coming up that you now have free, you have a free hour next tomorrow or the day after that you didn't know you had from before, go onto our landing page and sign up for another session that maybe you thought you couldn't make it to when you first registered. That's always open and it's always available. That having been said, I want to go ahead and ask our last question and give our presenters the last word. This comes in from Lori Wilkinson. And the question is, thank you for sharing this important intervention with us, Dr. Salinas and Dr. Santos, with the outcome of recognizing and eliminating academic apartheid in multiply marginalized communities. I wonder if you can share any strategies you all use to deal with microaggressions that you experienced so you didn't get deterred from the goal. That sounds like a good question to end on.
I will start off by saying, so the person that we were working with, the principal who's, kind of gave us this project, or we collaborated with, is also a woman of color. And so we knew that there was going to be a lot of microaggressions. We already anticipated coming. And so one of the tactics that I told her that I use, especially that is very common amongst many women of color, not just in academia, but broadly, is that I often prime folks, right? So I knew that you can't just kind of go in and are like, bam, even though you don't want to like ruin the integrity of what you're saying, because it's just going to put students, I'm so used to saying students, it's going to put, the folks who are in collaboration with us completely off, and then it's just going to lose the message. We're not going to get anywhere with it. And so what I call it, I don't know if this is a correct word, but I prime them first. And so, of course, it was inevitable that, I would get the microaggressions or these contrarian or devil's advocate. And so I would do something to the effect of like, I really appreciate how you said X. However, and then I would go into Y, right? And I felt like that was one of the tactics that I used quite a bit in actuality, because it allowed folks to let them know that I was open to what they said. I heard what they said, but ultimately I was able to kind of stand my ground on what I was saying. So that was one of the tactics. You think of any, Dr. Santos?
Oh my goodness, not clearly right now, but I would like to revisit this in a later date with you, Lori, if that's okay with you.
I think we also used a good number of stories. And so, Chicanx communities, we often are big on storytelling as method. It's something that's really important to us. And so oftentimes folks get lost in numbers. Folks get lost in statistics and they just see it there. And then it's just like, okay, they don't stay with it. So oftentimes they would say, like, they would kind of check out, and then in order to bring them back in, I would then kind of switch it up on the spot and say, okay, who has an example of, can somebody tell me a story of, whatever. And then, faculty would kind of be, shocked to hear that one of, somebody that they actually work with or somebody they collaborated with had this kind of very real raw story that actually gave life to what we were talking about. But yes, sorry to cut it short.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our presenters, and did want to acknowledge Lori Walkington, not Wilkinson. Sorry about that, Lori. But again, wherever you are, if you're at home, if you're at the office, let's give a big round of applause for our presenters and thank them for taking time out of their day to join us and share these really amazing strategies for collaboration with us.